So Ken, it's up to you and Donald now.
Super. Thank you, Amanda. Today was developing material for today was really exciting and interesting for me. It was a topic I'd thought about in some depth, but I began to organize my thoughts and structure this because most of the way I had originally conceived of the automobile was as a social and technological phenomenon, and I hadn't really delved into its aesthetic phenomenon the way I did when I started preparing and thinking through this topic. And so I came up with a question that kind of drove my thinking as I went through it. But first I want to just say a little bit about what we've been doing these last 6 episodes. This episode has been, this series has been a series of questions about the structure of our society and the automobile. And we've talked about all of these things, how all these forces, early entrepreneurs and specific manufacturing processes created an environment that the automobile would slip into and flourish, and then in turn how the automobile shaped these processes. And in our last session here, I want to delve into the automobile as part of the process of artistic expression. And it turns out that this is a lot bigger question than I thought it was. Like all things with the automobile, every time you start digging into it, you just find that there's another layer and another question and another mystery. And when I got to the end of my research and my presentations and finalizing the notes, I ended up with a question I would have never asked before. And this is a question: is the automobile the most widespread and widely appreciated form of art in the modern world? And I mean, is that possible? Is that possible? If so, how would I know it? And if it is also true, why? Why would that be? And so these are some questions I began to resolve. And I don't know the answer to this question, by the way, but asking a question like this from an academic perspective, you ask questions that leverage ideas, that gives you a format to think through problems. And so this is a really interesting question to ask. And as I began trying to find ways to answer this, I started to appreciate how pervasive the automobile is an object and a process of art in our society. And I'm just going to fly through some of these. It's everywhere in film. It's everywhere in music as recurring themes. Everywhere you go, you'll find public sculpture that incorporate art objects. And I love this one on the left, the car spindle in Berwyn, Illinois. And I haven't seen it, but by golly, next time I head towards Illinois, that's going to be on my route. And Carhenge up in Nebraska. We have the whole automotive service industries, all the ancillaries. Remember, the automobile is part of a complex system, and you can't have the automobile with all the distribution networks and all the skills and all the manufacturing. And these too have been modified and become part of an artistic statement of everyday life. Gas stations, and we're all familiar with the beauty of collecting vintage gas pumps, for example, and how they represent stylistic expressions. That we can see the famous car wash in California. We think of the impact on marketing, and this is not a Delahaye or a Bugatti, but by golly, you know what? There's something really interesting going on, that these vehicles should speak to people. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about artistic expression. We're talking about something inside of the person speaking and communicating with the world around them. And we see it everywhere in fine art posters and photography, in t-shirts, in shop calendars. You start adding up this footprint of the artistic expression of the automobile, let alone galleries. And it's so interesting, you know, that the automobile is a serious gallery item in the Guggenheim, and you know, in the Pompidou, the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. The car is there as permanent exhibits, and so the car has taken on this new level of significance within the creative spirit of our societies, and it kind of makes me ask, why, how did this come to be? And so one of the ways I started thinking about this, it was actually about not quite 20 years ago. I saw this video game, and it was mentioned in a BBC article that there was a little video game where you could pimp your ride. And this was before the MTV show called Pimp Your Ride. But you could pimp your ride. And the thing that I saw in the article was that Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, had pimped his ride. And several members of MPs from the British Parliament had pimped their rides. And so I went to this game and I looked up how they pimped their rides. And I noticed something interesting, between the Labour MPs and the Conservative MPs, the Labour had a lot of for shizzle. It was really cool and dramatic and exciting, and bling. And the Conservative MPs were very stately. And I thought, well, is there some kind of political, is there some kind of political, deeper identity that becomes attached to the car? And at the time, I was working on this project where I was developing a course on the global history of transportation. And so I developed this itinerary of museums I was going to. So I was headed to the British Museum with a question. And my question at the British Museum was, did the Assyrians pimp their rides? And it seems like a silly question, but actually the question of personalization of the automobile as a means of expression is a pretty interesting question. Does that permeate human history? Because my gut feeling said it had to. It did. Because everywhere I go, and I followed through on this project looking at locomotives and looking at ships, figureheads in the 16th century on ships, the personalization on fighter planes in the Second World War, and bombers, nose art, and military. And everywhere we go, I found that people were using pimping their rides as one of the artistic ways that they integrated with the vehicles that were parts of their lives. And so I began looking at this, but I hit a dead end because I was going through their there were brass plates and door fixtures, and there were lots of stone carvings, but every chariot just looked the same until I came to this chariot. And I looked at this chariot, and this one was really different from all the other chariots. And the thing about it is I noticed that it had like these features right here.
To my close friend, I will never know.
Okay, we had these really interesting things going on. We had dangly bits up on the top, and we had really blingy body work, and then we had ornate wheels. And I said, okay, so this chariot has been pimped. And I was really happy with my answer until I kept going, and I found one that had almost the exact same thing on it. And so what I had actually seen was not the individual modifying their vehicle, but the hand of the stylist, the hand of the designer, and the imprint that it turns out that this is known as a Assyrian command chariot, and it's a representation of status. And so the stylist, the designer of the vehicle, was capturing in their artistic expression status, which is one of the things that become part of the formula of why people choose cars the way they do. And so I began to start asking serious questions about the stylist as an artist, and how does that happen in the automobile? And of course, the stylist has always been a fundamental part of the automobile. You look at these two cars from 1914, and when I look at these styles, and many people might say, off the cuff that, well, T's aren't styled, they were just functional. No, functional is a style. The T is a beautiful stylistic statement that represents elements of simplicity, and it has continuity with carriage backgrounds, and it has all kinds of artistic elements. But obviously, the very same year, this alpha or aerodynamic, something profoundly different is going on. There's a very different stylistic statement. And so I was wondering, is this part of that story and narrative? Now, I teach social history of the automobile at McPherson, and when I teach social history of the automobile, I want to make sure every student comes up with their own narrative about the automobile, because it's such a diverse subject. But there's a few things that I absolutely must have students know, and if they don't know it, then I actually feel like I failed if they don't know this. One of the things they have to know is about the Model T, and they have to know the complexity, the significance of the T, and the complexity of Henry Ford. That's one of the things. And there's only one other thing that I think every single automotive historian has to understand, and that's the story of Harley Earl. And so I want to say a little bit about the story of Harley Earl, and talk about a little bit about the ramifications for that in our artistic appreciation of the automobile and why the automobile is so significant. And I want to start with Alfred Sloan, because when Alfred Sloan became the president of General Motors in 1923, he was working in the context of the T, which was the single most successful vehicle in history, and the T had a niche. And so GM was a group of firms of Buick and Chevrolet, et cetera, with different backgrounds and different vehicles. And so he started to conceive of these in a systematic way as an alternative to the T, and he saw them as a progression. He saw that, you know, at the beginning of your career, you're starting out, you get your Chevrolet, and then life is good to you, and you get the Pontiac, the Oldsmobile. So what is it, though? The term 1925 is when the term range of cars for every person purpose is coined. But what is it that would differentiate these cars? How would you know which one's the Cadillac and how would it has to be immediately apparent to everybody, because it's not just a possession, it's also a statement about where you are in your life cycle, because cars had always been decorated, and the expensive cars had better craftsmanship and had been more ornate and more stylistic flourish. So how would you know? And so he began thinking through this process. And so the question of style, the question of not just style, but a systematic approach to style, becomes implicit in the fundamental structure of GM, which would shortly become the very largest corporation on the planet. And so the systematic knowledge and understanding of style would be spread out across the world from GM. And the vehicle for that would be Harley Earl. Harley Earl was in California. He began working his father's Customs Coach Works. And this is a really important innovation, was the use of clay prototyping, getting art clay. And the significance of it, actually, I'd read that, you know, decades ago, and I thought about it. It's included everything you see. They always say, oh yeah, he created clay prototyping. But I think it's really significant because I think it symbolizes something that was going on in his head, that he was approaching the car as a sculptor. He was approaching it as an artistic item and as a medium for artistic expression. And so the clay is more than a practical, it's actually a way of engaging your hands into the shaping and getting intuitive feel and engaging with the structures. But one way or another, in 1919, the Earl's Automotive Works was purchased by a Cadillac dealer, and then a vice president from Cadillac was visiting, touring the West Coast, and he saw the work that was happening at Don Lee's dealership. It made its way back east, and then in short order, the art and color section was created at GM, and Harley Earl was appointed its director. One of his other important contributions is something called dynamic obsolescence. And in many sources, when you read this, they would say this is the precursor of planned obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is where I make something that's only going to last a certain amount of miles. And I really think that's unfair to this. I think dynamic obsolescence has a very different meaning in a very, very different context. And dynamic obsolescence is an observation that style isn't static. For example, let's say you want a feeling of something new. And this is one of the things that drives people within a market and shopping and people who want to experience art, is they're looking for a new expression, and you get something new, and then you get it, and a year later it isn't. And you've got to have another statement. There has to be some new statement. And kind of the real beauty of what Harley Earl did is kind of this underlying premise of design, was that his concept of design was going to be looking both backwards and forwards. He was going to try to create something new at the same time that was taking a look back. And so style, the development of style, becomes in many ways an incremental process. And so this is when GM establishes automotive styling as a core of automotive success, because it was fundamental to the structure of their profits and of their marketing and of their vehicle design. So style becomes king. And of course, Harley Earl was oversaw design at GM until 1958. And so as the director of the art and color section, and as it changed names across time, he had an imprint on essentially every vehicle that came out of GM. He had some ways where he had inputs. He could like it or not like it. He could voice interest in it. And so he was a profound influence. And one of the reasons is because of very early successes. Shortly after he was appointed, he directly oversaw the 1927 Cadillac LaSalle, which is just stunningly beautiful. And it's a classic of design that looks, again, and every single year people look at this car and just say, that is wonderful. You know, and for all I know, until the very end of time, people will look at that car and say, there's really something wonderful about that car, that it has some kind of eternal elements within it. And I don't know, that's pretty presumptuous of me. Styles change, things come and go, and who's to say? But there's something that, and of course the 34 LaSalle was also successful, and it was a dramatic rewrite, and you can see how these are different directions. One of the things that Harley Earl is most well known was the Y job. And back in those days, Y had a special connotation within genres of cinema and magazines and films. It was kind of like the X-Files right now, where we have the X-Files. They would use Y was synonymous like that. So there were Y files and Y spies instead of X and stuff. So it implied secrecy, top secret. So it was the first concept car. It's often known as. And one of the important things about this, it wasn't for sale. And it was a test bed for mechanical and aesthetic visions, and it was a marketing tool to demonstrate leadership. So cars had another purpose within GM that they did not have in other places to this extent. And of course, it's noted for these stylistic and engineering flourishes, the waterfall grille, these door handles, powered hidden lights. It's beautiful, and you can see the joy that Harley Earl has. You know, just look at that face. There's a happy man in his car. So there's the Y job. Harley Earl had a massive influence on cars. There were so many that he was directly involved in. My personal favorite in the upper left hand is the LeSabre. I was lucky enough last year to be with Jacob Gilbert, the curator of concept cars and experimental cars and prototypes at GM, and I went for a drive with Jacob Gilbert and LeSabre. And what you can really appreciate is the perfection of interior layout and the dashboard and the details, and that it's a completely immersive experience when you get in that car. Of course, these were all groundbreaking vehicles that were part of his touch. And the lower right is among the more famous Project Opal, which eventually would become the Corvette, that he had a very direct process in, but he had an indirect process in everywhere. And his effect is even far reaching because everybody was watching GM. GM was the definitive automaker on the planet. And so he would have echoes in design everywhere. He didn't create design everywhere. And there were a lot of other brilliant designers who were working off different inspirations. However, one of the reasons why the artistic element of the car is so well defined in our society has to do with that. And when I think about, I've been thinking this through, and maybe style is in fact the primary connection between the user and the car. Maybe the artistic impulse is really the first thing that the automobile is about. And I've thought about this so many ways because different people approach a car with different criteria. They're looking for different things. Some are looking for fuel efficiency or passenger capacity. But given two cars, you want, if passenger capacity is the thing you want, given two cars with the same capacity and the same criteria, you're going to choose the one that looks better. You know what, you got two cars and they have the same environmental impact and that's your criteria, you're gonna pick the one that looks better. And so these criteria that I've listed up here, I was just shooting from the hip and thinking, you know, brainstorming about them. And some people don't really care as much about environmental impact. And some people really don't care about acceleration. And everybody has their different criteria. But every one of those, every single person who engages with the automobile, if they have one of those other criteria as well and it's satisfied and it's matched between two different cars, they get the one that looks better. And so the fundamental aesthetic experience of the automobile is, I think, something that has not been given the credit that it deserves. And so that's kind of my biggest takeaway from this exploration into the automobile. And so at this time, thank you for being part of this. I would like to turn it over to Donald. And Donald hasn't seen this yet. He didn't know which way I was going, and so I know, Donald, that you have some interesting thoughts, and I'm dying to hear your perspectives on this.
Well, Ken, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I was smiling from your first slide because I thought, this is really funny. As you said, I had no idea what you were going to put up. However, you hit all of the points that I would have made in a conversation that the two of us would have had on the telephone. And especially very funny, starting with the Model T, the 1914 Model T, and the Castagna-bodied Alfa Aerodynamica, one of my favorite cars on the planet, of course. And it's very interesting. But I would have to say that the 1914 Model T, especially that Roadster that was there, was primarily designed and aesthetic. It took a traditional carriage form and made it into a horseless carriage, while the Alfa was completely about function. They had already begun to experiment with wind tunnels in Italy and scale models, and that car was actually developed from some early wind tunnel work in Torino. And ultimately, it proved an avenue that wasn't followed very closely because, of course, it had sealed windows, so that vehicle got extremely hot inside, and the radiator was buried inside of that intake, and so enough air did not actually get to the radiator, so apparently every time the car ran, it overheated. So it's very funny that the old-fashioned carriage aesthetics of the Model T were more practical than the aerodynamic design of the Castagna Alfa Romeo. So even then, it proves something else, which is, I think, central to design and our appreciation of design and what design means in cars. The fact that there are aspects of design that are driven by the public, by society, and then there are aspects of design that are driven by engineering and aspects of design that are purely aesthetic. And people often ask, what becomes a classic design? And a truly classic design, one that stands the test of time, is one in which those three elements converge, whether mostly accidentally, quite frankly. But you also mentioned the Y Job and the LeSabre, and it was terrific. Last year at this time here in Newport, we opened a show at the Audrain Automobile Museum, a survey of GM design. And we were fortunate enough to have General Motors loan us 11 cars from the Heritage Collection. So we had the Y Job, the LeSabre, the Cadillac Cyclone. The exhibition ran from a 1931 Cadillac V16 Sport Phaeton to the 2006 Cadillac 16 concept car. And we had the Aerovet, and Ken Lingenfelter loaned us 2 cars from his collection, the Dontoff Mule, the first V8 powered Corvette in the early C1 body, and the Corvair, which was the concept hardtop fastback Corvette. And so we also had the Impact Experimental. So we saw this whole idea of GM design and how it evolved over the decades. And the fact that in here, insert shameless plug here, in the book that I wrote, Stile Transatlantico, Transatlantic Style, A Romance of Fins and Chrome, I talk about the creative exchange between Italy and America after World War II. But it starts with the roots of design as it relates to the public. And today we live in a world where everything is designed. You know, you don't have to go to a special design store or a museum store or a gallery to get something which is designed. You buy things at Target, which are designed by some of the greatest designers on the planet, and pure function now has to have an aesthetic component. And I was chatting with Michael Simcoe, the current VP of Design for General Motors, and I was talking about the challenges that designers faced back in the 1940s or 50s and what they face now in terms of the standardization of design through regulations, for instance. And he said something very interesting, I thought, that it was much more challenging to design today because the basic level of design is so high. To get something that truly attracts someone's attention, you have to do something that stands out from everything else. And when you're a manufacturer building tens of thousands or hopefully hundreds of thousands of a car, it can't stand out too far, otherwise you don't get enough of a market of people to buy it. So people often complain that so many of the cars today look alike, whereas back in the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, cars had identifiable traits that made one very, very different from another. And that is the kind of thing, ultimately it's the emotional connection you mentioned quite specifically. If you have two vehicles that have the same dynamic characteristics that you're looking for, you're going to choose the one that you find is better looking. And what defines better looking, because something that you may think is attractive, I may think is hideous. It's the thing that connects with me and connects with you emotionally. Ultimately, cars are about emotion. I've often made the statement when people say, well, I'm not really a car person. And I say, well, everyone is a car person. You may not identify as a car enthusiast, but I guarantee that you've got a car story. Everyone has a picture of themselves, a photograph of themselves with a car. People do not take photographs with their refrigerators, with their laptops, with their houses even. So there's always a personal connection with a car. And to see what Harley Earl did in establishing the art and color section was really to bring to the general public the idea that style was not something for someone in Hollywood. Style was not something for someone who was a sports figure. Style was something that could improve your life, make you smile when you walked out of your house to see your car parked at the curb. It gave a lift to your life. And through design, through color, it was sort of the great democratization of design. I think that's what Harley Earl and GM achieved. There's a booklet, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Now, I just forgot the name of the booklet. It's called, I'll come back to it. There's a booklet put out in 1955 for the first time by the General Motors Design Department. It coincided with the opening of the General Motors Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. And it basically was the first, and I think probably the largest attempt of a major manufacturer of a consumer product to teach the public why style was important. It's called Styling the Look of Things. Thank you. And it talked about the role of the stylist in not just automobiles, but in household appliances, in furniture, in textile design, and why this is so important. Obviously, they had an ulterior motive. If design was important, so then you got to the fact that if my 1955 Chevrolet was a beautiful car and my neighbor gets a new 1957 Chevrolet, well, it might be more beautiful, so I have to move to the latest style. So that's an important thing to sort of keep up with design as it evolves. But what they did, and it was so incredibly daring, they followed this up with displays in the great Motorama shows, and they made a wonderful film of it as well, which I recommend to everyone. Check it out on YouTube. You can look it up, Styling the Look of Things. And it's a wonderful film that talks about the role of the designer and how design plays a role in everyday life. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I mean, they went to the point of talking about the color wheel and complementary colors and the golden rectangle and how aesthetics and mathematics are so intrinsically connected. And you look at a great car like this 1930 Packard behind me, and you can see that there is a form, the height of the tire and the wheel and the shape of the fender relative to the height of the belt line all make something that's very aesthetically pleasing. If one of those things is slightly out of focus, you get something that, you know, sort of makes you angry when you look at it almost. And then to my other side, I've got an Aston Martin DB4 Vantage. Now, from the corner that you can see on the screen, you think it might be a DB5, but it's DB4 Vantage. And it also shows something else, which I've spoken to a lot of designers that I've come to know over the years, and I observed something personally, and these designers have reinforced and enhanced that thought, which is the fact, and try this, everyone who's watching this, try this at home. Wash your car. A well-designed modern car is easy to wash. Your hand flows across it, never any awkward moments of transition. And it's something that I didn't think about. I thought, wow, you know, this is just a wonderful car, and I'm appreciating this so much, washing a car. And that is another sign of good design. Good design moves from one element to the other effortlessly. I just lost your audio here. Sorry.
There we go. Yeah, I was unmuted. Yeah, that's really wonderful and fascinating. Cool. I think, Amanda, that any other comments you want to touch on before we turn it to Q&A?
Well, just one more that I did want to touch on, which is the fact that I think it is so important that everybody learn to appreciate cars the way that is personal for you. Amanda touched on the fact that I've always been a big supporter of McPherson, and having met lots of McPherson alumni over the years, but my visits to the school showed me that there is no substitute for a direct connection with what it is that you do and every day of your life. I am so incredibly blessed and unbelievably grateful that I get to do this every day of my life. It's extraordinary. And I think that possible for everyone if they just give it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happened on my journey through this content is I thought that pimping your car was the personal expression, but actually the personal expression is the appreciation of it, because appreciation is personal and it's a statement of identity and your values and your tastes. And the other thing that came to me as we were through this discourse is that one of the really interesting things about style is that it draws you to it, but then it changes the user. That's the fascinating things about style. Because of it, you begin to appreciate different things. You see things in different ways. You acquire different capabilities and capacities. So good style is not a passive engagement. It's an active process. And I think that's one of the things that has really excited me about looking at these artistic elements of the automobile. Amanda, do you have some questions for Donald or for me?
I do. We have a number of questions here. Let's start with, where does Donald rate the Y job and the LeSabre and the overall scope of Earl's work?
Okay, that's a great question. I happen to love the LeSabre because it has all of the exuberance that Harley Earl stood for, without some of the sort of excesses, shall we say, that we got to by the time we get to the 1959 General Motors cars. There's a certain flair and sportiness about the LeSabre that I really love, and especially that it takes those jet airplane elements and unapologetically uses them, the big red stoplight in the rear. The Y job, on the other hand, I think is one of the most beautiful and elegant cars ever created. We often think about sort of what could have been, what would have the progression of car design been had World War II not intervened. When you think about the 1938 Y job and you put it next to a 38 Cadillac or 38 Buick, standard production car, it's from another planet. It's literally a decade ahead of its time. So I think that we would have seen, probably had the war not intervened, certainly by 1943 or 44, we would have full envelope bodies, and by 1945, 1950, who knows where we would have been. So it's an incredible road not taken. The Y job is an amazing achievement.
Great. We have 2 requests for the styling video that you mentioned. Could you share the name or how we could look that up?
Actually, yes, because the booklet is called Styling the Look of Things. The movie is called American Look.
American Look.
American Look. Yes.
Put that here so that others can see that in the answers.
Yes.
What is your favorite part when assessing vehicles? Is it the historical analysis or the styling review?
Yes. I love the way cars look. The design of cars has always been a great passion of mine. You didn't mention it in my bio because it would be 14 years long, but I was an art major in high school. My intention had to become a car designer. I was deflected by music and distracted by music and became an opera major in college and became an opera singer. But the design of cars has always been very close to my heart. So the aesthetics are always what draws me. But also, cars are history. One of the things that I love about living a life with cars is the fact that every time I get behind the wheel of a vintage car, I'm living in history. They are living time machines, and it's absolutely extraordinary. This very morning we shot a video for our YouTube channel where I was driving a 1951 Delahaye 135M Chaperon Cabriolet. And just the tie into that car, I was driving through the morning fog by the beach in Newport, and with the yellow Marshall headlights blaring, and it was just an amazing thing. I felt like I could have been in France in 1950 or France in 1938. It was just absolutely amazing. It just takes you to another place.
Okay, we've got some really great questions here. So Mary Kay has asked if you could have a car designed by Harley Earl or Raymond Loewy, sorry, I don't know. Which one would you choose?
Here's where I have to change my name and put on dark glasses and a big hat. It would absolutely be Harley Earl. Raymond Loewy was a very, 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 very talented guy, but he never designed a thing in his life. He ran a studio with very, very talented designers who he worked really hard at keeping anonymous. He was a great, make no mistake, he had a wonderful eye and he had a wonderful way of managing teams. So he knew what his clients wanted, like Studebaker or Coca-Cola or General Electric, but he never designed anything. And the cars that he had the most direct design influence in, some of his own personal cars, are fairly hideous. So yeah, Harley Earl without a doubt.
Okay. During the early time, how would you rate the Tatra T87 on aerodynamic design?
The Tatras are absolutely spectacular, among my favorite cars on the planet, and they were extremely aerodynamic. Again, going back to that 1914 Alfa Castagna Aerodynamica, the Tatras also came out of wind tunnel work. Hans Ledwinka, who designed the cars, was extremely smart and very, very clever. And despite my good friend Jay Leno just put out a video on his YouTube channel with his Tatra, and he called it the world's greatest Nazi killer. And the cars can be a bit to handle at high speed if you're not familiar with it, because they have a lot of weight behind the rear wheels. But they were very well designed and extremely efficient. They got superb gas mileage for their time, and also very good power to weight ratio, because of their slipperiness, they didn't need as much power to reach the speeds that they could. And that was one of the things that made them tricky to drive. People didn't realize how fast they were.
So Donald, I'm going to challenge you and kind of combine two questions that may not actually fit together.
Okay.
So we'll see. I'm sure you can answer it regardless. So one question is your thought on style versus presence in describing an automobile. And then we have another question that said, a person who commented, one thing that shocked him about seeing the LeSabre in person was how small and low it is. In pictures, you wouldn't necessarily think about that. I know that the wheel diameters were small as well. Can you think about perspective and what Harley brought to that aspect of design? So we kind of have perspective in terms of scope, in terms of perspective, and then style and presence when you're describing an automobile. So maybe work those two together if you can.
Sure, I'll answer the second one first, and I know that Ken will find this amusing as well, I think. I'm wondering what this person's sense of perspective is, because the LeSabre is a huge car. It's immense. My God, I would not want to take my driving test and have to parallel park the LeSabre. The thing about the LeSabre and its proportions, the fact that it is extremely long and outrageously low. And especially
yes.
You see pictures of Harley Earl standing next to him. Harley Earl was a very, very tall man. When you have no idea how he actually fit in the car. And of course, there's plenty of room inside the car, as Ken will attest. But nonetheless, you see pictures of Harley driving the car, and his head still came above the windshield header. So the LeSabre is one of those cars, and that truly great design for me defies scale. If you see a photograph of a great car, you can't tell whether it's big car or small car. Only when you're standing next to it can you tell. If you can tell the scale of a car immediately when you see it in a photograph, it's not a great design, because it's not balanced enough so that it doesn't give its secrets away at once. In terms of presence, that's a great question, because that's often something that comes up at Concours d'Elegance when I judge at Concours d'Elegance or give advice to judges at Concours d'Elegance. When there's some category in the judging for elegance, there are certain cars simply are not elegant because they were designed to be functional, race cars, for instance. However, you can have a race car that is not very pretty, that has amazing presence. It just tells you exactly what it's meant to do while you're staring at it parked. And another car, just quite interesting, we were arranging the cars here in our car storage building for the shoot. And next to me, unfortunately you can't see in this picture, we were going to use another camera for this, is a spectacularly beautiful, you know, I may actually move the, hold on, I just have to do this because.
Oh yeah.
It's a 1939 Alfa Romeo 6C 2500 coupe by Touring Superleggera. one of the most beautiful cars ever created. And it's a very interesting thing because it's a car, to me, that combines everything. It has amazing presence. It's very elegant. However, it's also a very fast and powerful car. And it looks like an elegant, fast, and powerful car. What it promises, it delivers. And that is the greatest thing in design. In this spot, right before we parked this car here, was a Rolls Phantom, 2002 Rolls Phantom, long wheelbase. And it's a car, when those Rolls Phantom first came out, a lot of people, myself included, thought it was fairly hideous. However, it had an undeniable presence. And it has retained that presence to this day. And it is something that over the course of time, 2 decades from now, people will remember, 3 decades from now, people will remember that this Rolls-Royce existed. And you knew that it was coming down the road. It will never be a pretty car, no matter how long it lasts, but it will always be a car that says Rolls-Royce. At the same time or similar time, Mercedes-Benz introduced their Maybach line of high-end cars to compete in that same range. It was a lovely car. It looked pretty. It looked just like the Mercedes S-Class. And no one can remember what a Maybach looks like today, but that Rolls-Royce will be remembered, even though the Maybach was probably a more attractive car.
We have a question from Mike. Can you talk about some of those cars that were tagged as ugly that we really should appreciate? Anything that...
Well, I recently, in the current show in the Audrain Museum right now, it's called Shining Bright, the advances in automotive lighting. And we have vehicles going from a 1901 Winton through to a 2020 Ducati Panigale motorcycle, talking about the development of lighting. And one of the cars in the show is an Edsel Corsair convertible to show the quad headlights and the effect they had on design here in America. I happen to think that Edsels, which have been maligned forever as being hideously ugly cars, are very attractive cars for their time. I think they're great statements of the time. They're very bold, they're very confident, and compared to some of the, sorry to say, a 1958 Edsel and a 1958 Oldsmobile, the Edsel's a much more attractive car than the Oldsmobile. And yet the Edsel is, you know, sort of maligned forever as having been a hideous and ugly car. On the other hand,
I'm sorry, why do you think that is? That was another question somebody said, is why did it fail design-wise? What were the elements in it that just really made it?
I think most of the decisions, and again, here I will offend everyone in the audience who either is or wants to be a Wall Street analyst, but I think that a lot of this was Monday morning quarterbacking. When the car failed to sell, people looked for a reason why it didn't sell. And if they didn't like the way it looked, they said, well, it's because, obviously it's because it wasn't styled very well. Had the car sold brilliantly, everyone said, it's a new design direction. And so, you know, we can frequently see things like that. You look at the Continental Mark II. Again, one of the most beautiful American cars ever made, very understated, subtle, elemental. The car was horribly expensive and did not sell well. The Continental Mark III that followed it in 1957 and the Mark IV in 1958 were hideous boats. They sold 4 times as many as they sold of the understated car. So, you know, sales and styling don't always go hand in hand. So
I'm going to change a little bit. We had a question about your favorite road trip car. So Donald, our first in the series was epic road trips. And so we talked a lot about historical road trips and then road trips in the modern era as well. And so if you were going on a road trip, what car would be your favorite?
Well, Amanda, considering that you and I have been on a road trip together, you know, it's a very funny thing. Without escaping the answer to this question in any way or evading it, it's a bit of horses for courses. I love taking road trips. I've been fortunate enough to drive across the country 5 times, and I can't wait for my next opportunity to do it again. I enjoyed 4 of those times very much. The 5th time was in a 17-foot Penske truck, which I would not recommend to anyone. That wasn't a lot of fun. But I have a tendency to like coupes. I like to have a roof over my head. I'm not really an open car guy, although convertibles are nice for an afternoon. I wouldn't want to drive a very long distance in a convertible. I did the Mille Miglia Storica in Italy in a totally open 1946 Fiat, and it rained for 2.5 days. So, okay, I've been there, done that, check that off the list. Thanks, don't have to do it again. I recently acquired a 1981 Ferrari 400i, a car that a lot of people have ignored for a very, very long time. And worse yet, it was the first Ferrari available with an automatic transmission, and mine is an automatic. It's got a GM Hydromatic transmission, and I'll tell you, anybody who thinks it's not a great car has never experienced the kickdown on a GM turbo hydromatic transmission with a Ferrari V12 in front of it. That is amazing. And this is a car you could cruise down the highway in for hours and hours and hours, get off of the highway and find a nice twisty road. It's as much fun on that. So those are the kind of cars that I tend to like. Cars that can handle the great sweepers and also the tight bits and the relaxing, long, high-speed cruising bits. Much like my my Fiat Oscar coupe that I had on the SCM rally that we did together.
Here's what I look forward to hearing your thoughts on. Was 1958 a year of too much chrome?
Well, generally, you can never have too much chrome except if you're a 1958 Oldsmobile. I love chrome. Chrome is fantastic. Chrome has to be used well in order for me to like it. There are cars that have absolutely no chrome trim on them at all, which desperately need chrome trim. And then there are cars where, you know, I like the quote of the great designer Coco Chanel, who, when advising women to get dressed in the morning, get totally dressed, put on all your accessories, then take one thing off and then leave the house. And there are a lot of designers in the 1950s that accessorized the design and then put one thing on before the car left. And it's sort of known that Harley Earl was a big fan of decoration. And so generally for him, more decoration was better. And it also was a part of, going back to what Ken mentioned also, I wanted to get to this too, the great GM ladder of success. And frankly, if you were paying more for a car, you wanted more chrome trim. You wanted people to know how much you were paying for a car. So if you didn't have all the chrome trim, obviously you've gotten the lesser model. So, you know, you had to satisfy the public.
Is there an example of a car that was over-designed that did not turn out well, keeping with our theme of maybe too much?
Once again, I keep doing these not so subtle plugs for Audrain Auto Museum YouTube channel, but do go to the Audrain Auto Museum YouTube channel and watch. We recently did a video on the Spiker C8 La Violette, and it's a stunning car, which is an absolute triumph of over-design. There's not one design element that the designers left out. It looks like an airplane. It's got acres of quilted leather. There's engine-turned metal. There are exposed switchgear for the shift mechanism. The air vents are little propellers. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. You think there is enough design in that one car for about 6 or 7 cars, easily, spread like peanut butter.
So Ken, do you see any questions there in the Q&A that you'd like to highlight and ask Donald? There are lots of really good questions, but I'd love some help. You're muted. I'd love some help.
I was going to say, I've just been enjoying the ride here, listening to Donald, so I wasn't paying any attention to what was coming across there.
All right, well.
But I did want to bounce off of something that Donald said earlier about someone who may not identify as a car person, but is a car person. And one of the points we had in this series was that we wanted to illustrate for people how pervasive the automobile is with in their lives as a globalizing economic force, as a source of employment, as artistic creativity, of technological advance, that it is it's deep in the blood of everyone. And one of the things that I wanted to happen was that people would see this and they'd come to a theory, an understanding of what it is about their life that's been fundamentally shaped and how their life is improved. And so it's not a matter of identifying a car, but everybody needs to have a theory of the car because it's a central feature of their life. And if you live your life where it's disconnected and you don't understand the forces at work, you're at sea. And so that was one of our goals with this, and it really resonated with some of your comments earlier, Donald. Yeah,
Ken, I think it's one of those things that today we take so many things for granted. I mean, you know, I know that I'm certainly guilty of this. Technology has advanced to the point where I complain if I can't get a signal on my cell phone if I'm in the middle of nowhere. Excuse me, in the middle of nowhere, I wouldn't have had a telephone.
Yeah.
And so it is one of those things that we don't realize in the incredibly short time that the automobile has been a part of practically every person's life on the planet, or touched it in some way, even if it's the fact that you may not own a car, you may be in a place that none of your neighbors own a car. However, you get things delivered to you by truck. You mentioned it in the graph that you had up about war. The mechanization of World War I, the effect that mechanization had on World War I was profound. And especially because of the fact that basically the armies were fighting 18th century wars, and all of a sudden you had this mechanized vehicles on the field. And so everyone's lives have been touched by the car. And I happen to think, not just simply because I'm an optimist and not simply because I'm a car enthusiast, but I think that it is for the better. Yes, there are negative aspects that the automobile has brought to us over the last century, but I think that the overwhelming effect on the automobile has been a positive one. It has made the world much smaller and much more mobile, and those are two very good things, I think.
Yeah. One of the things we've been developing is, and this kind of, I've been developing a generalized theory of the car. And essentially it comes from a comment that Sigmund Freud made about humans being prosthetic gods, that technology is a way of extending our travel and our thought and our ability to retain knowledge and our ability to communicate. And for the automobile, it becomes the ultimate aesthetic because it's something that provides an artistic outlet. It provides a capacity for freedom to explore the world, to engage professionally in the environment. And so the root of the car is it becomes a projection of all the different elements of the human being. And so because we have a desire for freedom and we have a desire to speak and to spend time, it's been the fundamental medium of our connection to other human beings, whether it's on road trips or how we communicate and spend time with family or who we have relationships with and how we get to have them, that it is become the central empowering feature of our world. And so a theory of the automobile is simply says that if you want to understand the car, all you have to do is turn your mirror inward, look at yourself, look at the things you want from life, look at the things that you find meaningful, look at the things you find frustrating, and when you look there, you're going to find the car in that spot. And so that's the really profound nature of the automobile.
And it's something that we can get back to some more questions too. It's something that I think people can also use the car and engagement with the car to help open their minds. I've learned so much as a person from the time I was a little boy by reading about cars and having a curiosity about cars. I learned so much about history and language. Those all came through my enthusiasm for cars because I wanted to learn more about, gee, this is a really interesting car. Who made it? Why did they make it? Who are the people that bought it? And those offered me doors into places I would never have gone before. And I think that's an opportunity. I love, again, I come back to my experience at McPherson with the Cars Show and with the various Cars and Coffee events and Cars and Coffee events that we have here, just meeting people who have so many different cars that I might not have even thought about before, but chatting with them about why they have or what their connection is with this car teaches me something I didn't know before and opens up a door that I may want to find out more about this. And that's something that to me is absolutely fascinating.
Well, as you can imagine, it looks like I sit here and have an easy job, but the fact is we just get buried with questions. Right now we have 17 questions we have not answered yet. There's no way we're going to get through them all, and the pressure falls to me to pick which ones. So I apologize if we don't get to your questions, but there are really good questions here.
I'll give you Amanda's home number.
That's right. give me myself. I can't answer them. I should give them your cell phone number. There's one though that that jumped out at me, and now I'm not going to be able to find it, but it connects, Donald, in your introduction, we talked about all of the different areas of life that you immerse yourself in: art, food, music, automobile. And for those who don't know, Donald, for how long were you a professional opera singer? What was that time span?
Forever. I pursued my career from well, actually, my first professional singing job was when I was 12 years old. So, and I retired from singing at 31. But I still continue to sing every now and then, as you know.
Yes, I do.
And so, yeah, I basically pursued my operatic career for about 10 years.
So this question is related to that, but of course I have to, sorry everyone, I'm going to interrupt with the story. The first time I met you, Donald, I was not in the role of automotive restoration at McPherson College, but I had been invited for some bizarre reason to one of the early Historic Vehicle Association conferences. And we were in a small room, and I don't know, there were maybe 30 or 40 of us, I'm not sure. And you asked me if, you said, would you mind giving me a ride back to the hotel? And I said, no, that would be delightful. I had no idea who you were. I'm just going to admit that. And because the car world was completely new to me. And on the way back, you told me that you were an opera singer, and you even sang a little bit for me. So that's always a very special memory. So here's the question that I took a long time to get to. Because of your musical background, what do you like about automotive car sounds in the immersive experience? Things like Harley Davidson motorcycles that are tuned to sound great. I love that question.
Spectacular question. And in fact, it's very funny because I have conversations often with people about electric cars. And in fact, on this last season of Jay Leno's Garage, one of the cars that we featured in the Behind the Bowtie segment was an early Tesla Roadster. And Jay is a big fan of electric cars. And I said, I can't really wrap my head around electric cars in terms of an emotional connection, because for me, it's the sight of the car, the smell of the car, and the sound of a car. And unless I sit in an electric car and make vroom vroom noises, it's just not going to give that total fulfilling feeling to me. Again, we also shot a video last week we just posted with the Ferrari Dino 308 GT4. And the contemporary Ferrari V8 engine has such an incredibly wonderful sound. And I'm a baritone, so I'm particularly drawn to baritone sounds, cellos, saxophones, you know, the baritone life. And that engine is a baritone engine. And it has a wonderful, wonderful tonal range that actually vibrates inside your chest. And that's the kind of thing that I get out of the car. Cars sing to me. And especially a car with a manual gearbox where you can actually play the tune. If you want a little bit more of the higher range, you just hold it in gear until you shift. And so it's a wonderful thing. It's like vocalizing. I remember having an extraordinary experience, which is far too long to relate here. But I was fortunate enough to find myself many years ago in the garage of the Sauber Formula One team at a Formula One race. And I watched as they warmed up a Formula One engine. And of course, it's all computerized. But in order to get the oil and other fluids going and to get the temperature to the right place, the right RPM range, it's literally a programmed symphony where the car starts, it's I could see the notes on the score of a page. You know, it was absolutely extraordinary. So I love the sound of cars. And there are some cars, frankly, well, I won't get into that. That's another story. I'll save that one.
My kids roll their eyes at me because sometimes we'll pull up next to an automobile or a motorcycle and I roll the window down just a little so that I can get that sound fully in the car, and they just think I'm crazy.
Not to mention, there are cars also that you have to drive that you own. They have to find tunnels to drive through. Rhode Island has no tunnels. Yeah. One of the biggest problems with living here. There are no tunnels, so you can hear your own car.
Yeah, there you go.
Should that be a judging criteria for you? Should judging the sound be part of the Concours set? I mean, seriously, it's a fundamental part of the machine.
And that would be a great thing. However, the pessimist in me, the tiny pessimist in me, sees now an entire field of exhaust tuning to make your 2.5 cylinder DKW sound like a 16-cylinder Bugatti, you know, so I'm not quite sure about that.
I have two questions that in my mind I have committed that we will get to. So the first one is a comment from Fernando. He said, I had lunch with Alexander Mavel, Chief of Design for Group PSA. He said design has largely been homogenized because in order for manufacturers to remain competitive, they need to compete in various markets, and crash and safety standards are not globally universal. Is the age of daring design over?
Well, he is absolutely correct. The age of daring design is not over, however. Again, I come back to, in our current exhibition, two of the cars in the exhibition are a McLaren 720 and a Porsche 918. And I often bring guests through the museum and I point out the hood line on both cars is absolutely identical because of the European crash pedestrian rules. Having said that, there is still enough room to play with the shape of the front fenders over the wheels, the angle of the windshield. There are things that you can do, and frankly, it's just like in any sport where they put regulations down. Truly imaginative engineers find a way to meet the regulations and then find a new way through. So I think, without insulting any designers out there, I think it's sort of a lazy designer that says, oh, I'm forced to do this because I can't do anything else. Think back in the 1920s and 30s, the engines were very tall. That was an obstacle the designers had to get over to still create an attractive car. There's always been obstacles to overcome. And yes, today the obstacles are more than there were before. So we're not quite in 1968 where you sort of take a pen on a paper, draw anything you want to and have it built. But nonetheless, I still think that there is room for interpretation and expression.
So Donald, our friend Neil from the Sports Car Market 1000 wants to make sure that you know that next year it has over 7 tunnels to travel through. So make your selection wisely.
Excellent. Excellent. Good news.
And let's see. So we have, I'm going to try to read, I'm not sure that these sentences make sense in my head, but I'm going to read it to you. Donald and Ken, thank you. Designing starts with need finding and knowing your user. In some cases, the users are also the mechanics and service people. The best designs realize that the driver and owner of a car is not the only user. My question is, what is an example of a car in the Audrain collection that is an example of this, where it is designed with the balance of form, function, usability? Have any of the cars you are working with struck you in this way?
Well, that's a great question. And in fact, it's something that comes up a lot in restoration because you quickly discover that there are many cars that were designed to be built and not to come apart, as you know at McPherson.
Yes.
Once constructed, no. And there are 2 cars that immediately come to mind. Actually, one car that I was just looking at here today, a fairly recent addition to the collection, a very, very, very rare car called an ATS 2500 GTS. Mm-hmm. And it's a car that was built in extremely small numbers. They built approximately 12 of them. And this is one of 3 alloy cars which were designed for racing. They were designed in a fascinating project led by Carlo Chitti and Giotto Pizzarini when they quit Ferrari at the end of 1962 after having won the world championship in Formula One, and took Phil Hill and Giancarlo Baghetti, the Formula One drivers, with them to start up this new team. They were going to build Formula One cars and conquer the world. They built sports cars and wipe Ferrari off the planet. It didn't happen. But nonetheless, it was very funny. We were looking at the ATS here, and cleaning it up is going to go to a restoration shop for its resurrection. And I was chatting with 2 of the fellows here that help maintain the collection and helping them open up the rear hatch. And I said, well, how does this open? I said, well, it opens here at the roof and it swings open. And it swings open totally, completely. Again, a road car, this is a GT road racing car, but designed by racing engineers. So you open up that rear hatch, you can practically step into the chassis.
Right, yeah.
So they knew what they need to do to make a car that actually worked and worked well. Having said that, one of the problems with the Formula One car they designed was the fact that it didn't have sufficient chassis torsional strength, so they ended up welding bars across the engine. So when they had to change the engine, they had to cut the chassis bars, take the engine out, put the engine back in, and weld the bars back in. So that's one of the reasons why the Formula One project didn't work. But nonetheless, that's an example of a car that's designed for both the user and the person who had to maintain the car as well. And
I'd add something about the need, the assessing need. Is it it's actually a bigger question, it seems, because you can't figure it out from your market or your audience. And it is a quote by Henry Ford, for example. If I asked people what they needed, they told me I wanted a faster horse. And so finding out what people need isn't about who they are, it's about who they might be. And so that's one of the challenges of design.
Absolutely.
Great. We have a couple of questions about the Tesla truck. It's very different than a normal everyday truck. Can you comment on the cancellation of the, let's see, this is two questions. Can you comment on the cancellation of the basic 3-box car to the proliferation of trucks and SUVs and the styling of the Tesla truck?
Okay, I'll start with the last first. The Cybertruck as introduced, I believe, is just a concept. I'm not quite sure they'll actually build that as a production vehicle. If they do, I think, again, it'll be something quite interesting. And I don't happen to like the way it looks, but again, I spoke a while ago about the Rolls Phantom as well. So whether I like the way it looks or not doesn't mean that it won't become an iconic, timeless design of its period. My question forms more about the utility. People buy trucks for utility. Yes, people buy trucks for style these days as well. But the heart of the truck market is ultimately one of utility. And I wonder about the utility of that vehicle. And so that's my only question about that, plus the fact that it's making noise. As for the demise of the 3-box design, hope springs eternal. I think that the 3-box design may come back, just as the station wagon, that long banished term, is also slowly coming back. We were at a time, probably about 10 years ago, when everything was an SUV. And now crossovers have come back. And frankly, if you look very closely at a lot of the crossovers, they're station wagons, or very tall sedans. And so eventually, again, going back to the question about use, what does the user actually need? People quickly realize there's a wonderful scene in the original Cars movie where the major general, who's the army fellow, who's I think he's a Hummer, is doing this off-roading boot camp with these 4x4s with really blingy big wheels and all this, and they're afraid to get their wheels muddy. And you think, how many people bought cars? Oh, I have to have the 4-wheel drive version. Well, how much do you go off-road? Oh, never. But I have to have the 4-wheel drive version. Why? Because. And then when they discovered that, the tire wear is twice what it is and the gas mileage isn't what they need, they then come back to what it is they actually need. I think that we will see a return to a more balanced assortment of cars as people actually want to buy what they need. Having said that, manufacturers also like to build as few models as they possibly can because it keeps their manufacturing costs low. So if they can base everything off of the same crossover platform and put a car nameplate on it, I'm not saying anything about the Mustang E, then obviously it benefits them. But I'm optimistic that cars will come back.
So Donald, we are at the time where we usually wrap up. We do still have a number of questions, and I think that what we're going to do, we discussed this with an earlier guest as well, is that we will gather these questions and send them to our hopefully willing participant guest who would answer some of those questions. And then when these go out on YouTube, because the collection will go out on YouTube, then we will send you the link to that, and we will also send you the link to some of those top questions that we didn't get to. So I don't want anybody to feel like we left them out. But I'm wondering, Donald, would you like to share some closing comments, and then Ken wrap it up for us?
Well, thank you, Amanda. First of all, once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be a part of this because I'm thrilled to be a part of anything in person. I'm also always excited to talk about cars, and I'm really excited to talk about design. And even more than that, this entire topic and this entire series really has spoken to me because, to me, automobiles are a completely immersive experience. They are not just something that is over here in a box. They're a part of our lives. They are a way that the human experience is expressed across the planet, and I think that it's something that's really important for us to understand and appreciate. These are some of the greatest aesthetic and mechanical and emotional creations ever made by man in his history on the planet. And I think that we are so fortunate to be able to celebrate them. So yes, thank you. And Ken, great job with this series.
Thank you, Donald. Ken?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo that I think the automobile is the most significant technological event in the history of humanity. It shaped more people in more ways. And that because it's been such a continuous part of people's life that it's become invisible to them. They're constantly shaped by it in ways they don't understand. And if you're really going to integrate your life and make sense of it and understand your future, you've got to engage in the automobile in some way, in some analytic way. The whole point of this series was to try to draw a bunch of threads together for people to tie the automobile to their lives and to tie the elements of the automobile to each other. Because it turns out that, you know, while we might talk in isolation about the globalization of the planet and talk about that separate topic from the liberation of women and talk about that as a separate topic from the mechanization of war, every one of them is profoundly interrelated. They're constantly linked. And so it's a vast spider web of causality in our society, and the automobile is one of the deepest integrated links. It's been a real joy for me to have amazing guests. Thank you for coming, Donald. And we had so many other amazing guests this time. I want to thank Amanda. This was, by the way, this whole series was Amanda's creative vision, and she provided all the resources and the organizational skills to make it all happen. So thank you, Amanda. And I would like to thank the college for supporting this great adventure and curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I will say, I put this in the chat as well, but we put out twice a year a beautiful magazine from our automotive restoration program. Donald has been interviewed in it before. This was our last issue. It was on global reach, and it talked about the international car culture and particularly highlighted where some of our alumni are working across the globe. You will be given an opportunity. We're not putting you on an extensive mailing list, but we will be sending you at least one more email that gives you an opportunity to opt into being on our mailing list. And I would love for you to not only have gotten out of this experience the car connection to humanity and how that works, but also the connection to McPherson College. And I would encourage you to find out more about our amazing faculty, our fantastic students, and the work that we're doing right here in the middle of Kansas. It is a mecca for young people who love automobiles. And so please follow us on social media, and you have my email. So if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all, and happy motoring.